After making the kitchen utensil holder for my mom, I was left with some cool cutoff pieces that I thought could make a nice jewelry box. So for this project, I'll be making a jewelry box to give to my brother as a part of his birthday gift. To accent the walnut walls, I'll be using some red oak for the base and the trim, and possibly one of these small brass hinges. These pieces were a little uneven though, so I'll have to square up the edges of the top and the bottom first. So I used a marking gauge to mark a consistent width across the walls. Then used a small plane to bring down the uneven spots. That was not smart. One of the miters came undone. Before I re-glued the miters together, I wanted to finish evening out the edges, so I repositioned the piece and continued more delicately. I decided to add some painter's tape around the outside to both provide more support for the miters as well as serve as a visual indicator of where the marked lines were. That way, once I started hitting tape with the planer, I knew that section was done and I could move on to the other sides. Now that the faces were cleaned up, it's time to even up the insides. So I marked a guideline that was equal to the thinnest side of the octagon on both the lid and the body. So I ended up picking up some new rasps. I got this set on sale. It comes with some metal ones, some rounded ones, as well as this rounded or convex and flat one. And I'll give it a shot and see how it goes. When filing down the inside of the walls, I took my time and applied little pressure due to how fragile the miters were. With all the surfaces cleaned up, I can now re-glue the miters that popped loose. I did this with some TiteBond 3 and painter's tape to hold the joints together. After 24 hours, the glue had cured, and I could now continue working on the jewelry box. Yeah, it looks pretty good. That tightened up a lot. So I think what I'm going to do next is clean up the insides with a chisel, since some of them still have a little bit of a bump or a raised spot in the middle. Just kind of clean up all the edges and get them down to a 1/4 inch for both the lid as well as the body. Like I mentioned, I used some chisels to further square off the insides of the pieces. Once the walls were completely square, I can now start working on the bottom of the box. Since I don't have a piece of red oak wide enough to cover the bottom, I'm just going to join and glue up 2 pieces of this 1/2 inch thick strip. So I cut the 2 pieces I needed for the bottom, and I was going to use the miter saw to cut out the thin 1/4 inch trim pieces, but quickly realized that the table saw would probably be a lot easier. To close off the lid, I'll be using some leftover acrylic from my gun cabinet project. Now, I don't have any tools for or experience with cutting glass at all. I do want to give it a try for a future project though, so let me know in the comments if you know of a good glass etching and shaping kit I should pick up. With everything cut, I can now join and glue up the bottom. So I made all the guide marks for the dowels and used a drill block to get nice and straight dowel holes. These pieces are about 1/2 inch thick, so I used some 1/4 inch dowels to add a little more strength to the glue up joint. One thing I found helpful when creating seamless glue ups is to apply a little bit of pressure to get a good glue squeeze out before sprinkling on the specific sawdust. I'm sure everyone has a preferred method of gluing up joints, but this seems to work best for me. I'm glad I put painter's tape over these clamp jaws. Not bad, time to sand it down. To even up the surface, I used 80 grit mesh paper. And that worked perfectly. Now to outline the octagon shape. While scoring the cut lines does prevent splintering, it also makes it a little easier to follow along the cut line with my pole saws. After the shape was cut out, I decided to rabbet the edges of the base to give the box a little more stability. So I marked a 1/4 inch guideline along the sides of the base and used a router plane to carefully remove the material. After, I used some 120 grit paper to clean up the edges, and then placed it on the body to sand the sides flush. And here's the result. Not too bad, but there are definitely some gaps that I'm hoping I can hide with some wood glue and sawdust. So I repeated the same glue up method I used for the base joints and glued the base to the body of the jewelry box. Just to ensure there weren't any gaps, I added a thin bead of glue to the outside seams as well. I then worked in some walnut sawdust, but looking back, I probably should have used red oak sawdust instead. You'll see why once I sand it clean. But while the base dries, I can start laying out the shape of the acrylic for the lid and cut the pieces to fit. Which I don't know how well I'm going to pull it off, but I need to cut these pieces in half. And then essentially I'm going to miter them all at 22.5 degrees. And then I'll have a top or a bottom and a top support glued into place. And that's how this will be framed on the inside. Yeah, like I said, that's going to be a tough one. Let me know, like, in the comments if you have an easier way. I'm sure there's a million different ways you could do this, and all of them are probably easier than the one I'm about to attempt. But yeah, like I said, I'm gonna give that a shot. So I marked a central line along the inside of each piece, and I swapped out the pine on my vise with teak so the surface was stronger and more square. This will make it easier for my pull saws to follow a straight cut line. So I cut all the pieces in half. And since the sides of the octagon have some variation, I numbered each piece so I know which side they go against. Time to cut the miters. Alright, so it'll sit like this, and then there'll be trim all around the front, or trim all the way around the top and the bottom. So I continued cutting the miters to all the trim pieces. So as unfortunate as that is, I'm probably going to have to redo it. I'm going to have to figure out something to where I can make these pieces on a miter, like the miter saw or something. Man, I don't know. Since the joints didn't line up, I had to redo it. So this time I decided to rip the miter angles on the table saw. And then cut 1/4 inch strips on the miter saw. Hopefully this will produce more consistent angles. With all the pieces cut, I used some CA glue to build out the frame before adding it to the lid. That looks a lot better, although I'm definitely going to have to recess the walls to get the new trim to fit. So like I did with the base of the box, I traced a cut line along the inner rim of the lid. I then marked a 1/4 inch depth on the inside of the lid. And then used a chisel to create a recess for the trim to sit into. I did this for all sides of the lid. So it's not pretty, unfortunately. There's a good amount of gaps around the sides, but I'm hoping that I can kind of hide it with some glue. The gaps along the sides were pretty large. I know using glue and sawdust is more of a visual band-aid than an actual repair, so I'll definitely need to work on becoming more accurate with my chisels. But instead of getting discouraged, I decided to continue on with filling the gaps the best I could. And I think that'll do for now. It looks pretty horrible at the moment, but I think once I sand that up, it'll look a lot better. This was one of those weird glue ups where I pretty much dug around to find any means of applying pressure for the glue to cure properly. Here we go. That'll work. The next day, both glue ups were dried, so I can now sand the pieces flush. Yeah, I should have used red oak dust for these. I didn't account for the sapwood walls, so some of the walls have a dark outline from the walnut sawdust. Not all the sides are like that, but some of them definitely stand out. With the outside cleaned up, I sanded the inside with some 80 grit paper. I plan on lining the inside with some velvet or fabric, so I'm not terribly worried about how these inner joints look. Time to see how the lid turned out. This one gap will definitely need more attention. I'll wait and see how it looks after I sand it smooth first. The trim I glued in place was about 1/8 of an inch proud from the lid, so I used an orbital sander to bring that down and even out the surface. Alright, so that didn't turn out too bad. There's a couple spots, like right here, and then that gap right there. There's a couple like smaller spots that I'll have to patch with some glue and sawdust again, but In terms of how it looks, I think that turned out pretty well. So now I'm just going to go through. I want to see what it looks like first, actually. So that's what it'll look like. I mean, obviously, but clear. I've got tape over it so I don't scratch it before I'm done. But that's how that'll look. And then I'm going to put some smaller pieces, which I've got this that I could use, and just trim down the outside so it fits. And to be honest, I might even just break these apart. So if I use these pieces and I go through and I make all the miters exactly the angle I need them to be and the size I need them to be, then it'll be perfect because it's already flush. I think I'm going to go through and do that, but as you can tell, some of the pieces are a little too long, so I'll have to cut them to the correct length. But I'm liking how it's looking so far. So I laid out all the pieces and marked the adjustments I needed to make. After seeing the gaps I left on the top of the lid, I decided to try a different mounting method for the inside of the lid. I then chiseled down the pieces so they would fit along the inside of the lid. Then numbered them so I wouldn't mix them up. And did this for all 8 pieces. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stain it first, and that way I can stain and get all in these areas before I put the acrylic in, because once the acrylic goes in and I glue this bottom frame on, I'm not going to be able to get in there. I don't know. I might, just for something different, I might give this a try. I'm going to go ahead and put some of this on a test piece or some scrap pieces to see how it looks first before I do it. I tested out the oil on some scrap pieces, and I actually really like the combination. The oil gives the walnut a warmer hue that pairs better with the red oak. Oh, I didn't even factor that in, that the inside, you're going to be able to see the pieces from the outside. So I'm going to have to trim these down. To keep the inside and the outside trim flush with each other, I had to shave off a small amount of each piece of the inside trim. Now, I'm going to re-oil the entire piece once it's done, but for now, I'll just slightly clean up the surfaces with 120 grit paper. So I just realized I need to go through and sand all the pencil marks off of these pieces first. Something I completely forgot to do, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now real quick. Then I'll oil it. So again, I'll be using this Howard Feed and Wax wood polish and conditioner. I decided to oil the entire thing, that way the color is more consistent and blends better together when I re-oil the final assembled piece. I'm really liking how the different materials look together. With all the pieces oiled, I'll wait a couple hours and then wipe off the excess. Now, something I didn't account for was that by sanding off all the numbers for the trim, figuring out where each piece goes became a bit of a guessing game. So once I found the correct orientation of the pieces, I renumbered them with some painter's tape. After waiting a couple days for the oil to fully cure, I glued the inside trim in place with some TiteBond 3. And then worked some red oak sawdust into the squeeze out to better hide the seams. Alright, not too bad. I'll let that sit overnight and hopefully I can clean that up tomorrow. The next day the glue had cured, so I can now sand it flush. I had to be very careful not to scratch the acrylic when sanding the edges. I probably should have taped the acrylic just to play it safe. So I've got these little brass hinges, which I think could look pretty nice on the back side. Maybe if I were to, I don't know, maybe if I like recessed it so that way it was flush with the back. I think that could look kind of cool. I just don't know how stable that's going to be, if this is going to wobble at all or have any play with just one hinge. I decided to try it anyway and got the drill bit marked for pre-drilling the screw holes. Then pre-drilled the hinge holes for the base. I then installed the 2 bottom hinge screws for the base and then lined up the lid to mark the top 2 for pre-drilling. Yeah, I'm not really liking how that looks. And it's not the most sturdy either. I feel like that amount of movement is not good. And as you could probably tell, after mounting the hinge, I was not a fan of how it looked. It felt cheap, and there was way too much play in the hinge for me to use it. So I took it off and decided to plug the drill holes. I lightly sanded the pencil marks off from the surrounding areas, and then filled the holes of the base with wood glue and heartwood walnut sawdust. That's not too bad. I'm going to let that sit And then I'll go ahead and do the sapwood spot now. Learning from my mistake on the base of the box, I made sure to use a similar color sapwood sawdust for filling these holes. I wanted the color to match as best as they could. After giving it some more thought, I searched around on Amazon and ordered a pack of these small barrel hinges to test out. I figured these hinges might give the box a cleaner look since they would be mostly hidden. The pack came with a bunch of different size hinges and magnets to use. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try one barrel hinge first. I'm going to install it and see what it's like. If it's very difficult to get right or I'm not a fan of the gap it leaves, then I'll use the same size barrel hinge as the magnets, and if I'm not a fan of how it looks, I'll just fill in the opening and use magnets for all of them. So the tricky part is that's going to be the gap. That's how much of a gap is going to be around the whole thing. So that's the part I'm not a huge fan of. Yeah, I might just do magnets. So I removed the barrel hinge and installed just magnets in its place. The magnets are pretty strong. That's one little magnet and I'm able to lift the back end up. But, and it's well aligned. Like I said, I think the magnets will be a little bit more forgiving in terms of alignment. I like the look and feel of the magnets instead, so I decided to add magnets to each of the 8 sides. Alright, got the magnets all installed on both sides. Holds it in place pretty well. I just got to clean it up and sand the outside so it's all flush and even. With the magnets installed, I did one final sand of the outside of the box at 120 grit. I did this just to be sure all the sides for the lid and the base were flush. I then used a tack cloth to get rid of the dust. And just when I was about to apply the final coat of oil... Oh man, I was worried about that. Yep, the hinge hole stuck out like a sore thumb. Those holes are pretty prominent. So, bit of an issue. After applying the oil, I quickly realized how badly these stick out. And I think I know what happened. When I laid out the screw holes initially for the hinge when I was testing out to see how it looked, I used a pencil. And because of that, even though I filled it with sawdust, glue, and I sanded it and I cleaned it all up, I think there's still some graphite left in there. And so when I applied the oil, it pulled out that dark black color and it got mixed in with the glue and the sawdust. I have a solution, and I'm going to try to keep this rambling short because this solution would fix 2 problems. It would fix the screw holes, but it would fix another problem that I encountered. And this is just kind of improper planning on my part. Obviously with magnets you have a north and a south side and they attract, right? South and south repel, same with north and north. When I laid out the magnets, I made sure that the ones directly across from each other attracted. I didn't pay attention to how I laid them out together for all the ones that are next to each other. What I should have done was I laid them out like, okay, these are all north and these are all south and they're all going to attract no matter the orientation. But because I didn't do that, when you lay it out the way it's supposed to, works fine. The second you try to pivot or rotate it, it does not want to line up. I think what I'm going to do, which would fix both of those issues, is add some sort of a visual design element that would indicate, hey, this is how the lid and the base connect and go together. And so what I'm thinking is if I chisel out a rectangle, which would remove the screw holes, and I have a little strip of red oak as an inlay for the back. I mean, obviously it would be disconnected so you could still take off the top, but it would be some sort of a visual indicator like, hey, this is how the lid and the base orient together, and it would remove the blatantly obvious screw holes. You know what, I'll mention it, but I don't know if I'm going to do it. I don't know if I have the skill set to do it. If I have the red oak edge banded, right, it's roughly this thick, you know, outside's nice and flush. If I did a walnut C for my brother's first name initial, if I did a walnut C, that looks decent. I think that could be a really nice personable touch. Even though I had my doubts, I decided to give it a try anyway, and I printed out a template of a couple different types of Cs that I could make out of walnut. So I cut one out and glued it to a scrap piece of walnut, and began cutting out the shape of the C. Not too bad. I then cleaned up the back with some light sanding, and used a coping saw to carefully cut out the shape. I then drilled out an opening in the middle and filed down as much as I could. Well, that is until I broke it, and then I just kind of sat in silence for a minute. Crap. Now, I'm going to give it one more attempt. I got pretty close on the last one, so I just got to slow down a bit when it comes to filing the edges. Okay, so I'm not gonna lie, I am very impressed with myself that I didn't break that. I'm gonna knock on wood because I will totally jinx myself, but that's what it's looking like right now. I still have a little bit of white to clean up, but to be honest, I'm kind of scared to clean it up anymore. So with barely any pressure, I sanded the edges with 400 grit to clean up any of the burring left from the file. Not bad. I'm glad I chose this C style instead. The letter thickness was a little bit more manageable. For the oak inlay, I decided to use some red oak edge banding since I was limited on width with the magnets installed. So I cut two segments that had a similar grain pattern, and then used an iron and some packaging paper to remove the pre-applied adhesive that came on the roll. There we go. Oh, that's perfect. I used some calipers to get an average thickness for the pieces, and mark the thickness onto the lid and base of the jewelry box. This will be my guideline for how much material I need to remove for the inlay. I then scored a 1.5 inch wide channel to remove for the edge banding strips, and then used a router plane to remove the material. The two pieces were a touch too wide for the section I removed, so I taped them in place and ran a cut down the middle overlap so the pieces joined together nicely. I clamped the lid to the base and continued removing material in line with the recess of the base. Then used some 400 grit paper to clean up the recesses. And now time to glue it in place. I used painter's tape to keep the pieces from shifting around while the glue cured. And after a couple hours, it was time to check on the glue up. It's looking good. Now I just need to separate the top and the bottom. After separating the two, I applied a little more glue to fill in some of the small gaps around the edges. Now to let these dry overnight. Now I know the glue and sawdust looks like an absolute mess, but it should hopefully clean up well after some sanding. I decided to hand sand these pieces at 120 grit to avoid removing too much material. Not bad. Time to move on to the interior. I went to my local fabric shop and picked up a couple different types of velvet as well as these fabric glue sticks. I was torn between the burgundy and the forest green color for the interior of the box, but the more I thought about it, the burgundy velvet is made of a stretchy material and it could be an issue if glue were to seep through. Now on the other hand, this green velvet had a thicker backing and would probably be a lot easier to work with. So forest green it is. Alright, so far so good. It fit pretty well. Obviously it was a little longer on the tops, and I did that on purpose so I could just get a nice clean flush cut around once I get it glued in there. I'm going to go ahead and fire up the glue gun, get that nice and warm, and then I'm going to try these fabric sticks and see how well they work. The fabric sticks worked pretty well, but as with all hot glue guns, I just had to be careful that the glue strands hanging from the nozzle didn't get caught on the velvet. I then shaved off the excess with a razor blade. It's funny because as I'm doing it, I'm like fighting the magnets because the magnets are trying to hold on to the X-Acto knife. Razor blade. I then tested to see if a lighter would help clean up the edges. And it did, so I decided to use it for the box lining. I just couldn't hang out in one spot for too long, otherwise it would start to burn the edges. Now to glue on the walnut C. Just make sure I'm gluing the right side. That'd be something I would do, is glue it on backwards. That'll work. C's all dried on. I think it looks really good. There's the so that's what it looks like closed. It's got the velvet inside. I'm gonna have to clean this off. The one thing I'm not a huge fan of is the white around the rim of the velvet, and that's just the backing to the velvet. I'm thinking maybe if I just go very, very slowly and just color only the white with a Sharpie, it might get rid of it, because it's really dark around the lip as it is. So I'm gonna see what that looks like. All right, so did that top corner. I don't think that looks too bad. I think I can make that work. So, very carefully, I colored only the white with a fine point Sharpie to see if it would give the edge of the lining a cleaner look. So I think that looks a lot better. It's still not perfect, but I don't really know what else to do to it. I'm going to go through and just kind of clean some stuff up with some hand sanding. You know, there's like a couple, this has a pencil line on it from when I traced it. Just clean up like little things like that before I do the final coat of oil. Sorry for the camera angle, I forgot to reposition my camera. But I'm pretty much just doing some final cleanup sanding at 120 grit before I get ready to apply the oil. Now to apply the final coat of oil. And after a couple hours, I came back and wiped away the excess oils. And while wiping down the piece, I noticed some hot glue strands that must have gotten stuck on the velvet, so I used the flat end of my glue brush to carefully peel them off. Then with a little bit of Windex, I cleaned the smudges off the acrylic. And the jewelry box was all done. While I debated for a while on what material to accent the walnut with, I think the oak turned out really nice, and it pairs well with the walnut walls. And while I wish I planned a little bit better with the magnet orientations, I still think they were a better choice than the different hinges I tested out. My favorite part of this project would have to be this walnut C. I know it's not perfect, but it's one of those instances where I'm glad I gave it another shot. I surprised myself a little with how it turned out. And while I am happy with the final result, there are definitely some things to note for future projects. This was my first time working with complex fabric lining, so while it's not perfect, it's the best I could do for the time being. If anyone watching has some pointers on working with fabric like this, please let me know in the comments. Like I mentioned before, the magnet orientation was definitely an oversight. Unfortunately, these magnets were so small that to remove them and redo it would result in destroying the surrounding wood, so I was forced to improvise the design. And this may just be me, but I feel like I relied a bit too much on glue and sawdust for this project. I'll keep practicing my chisel work to hopefully not rely as heavily on filling gaps in the future. But thank you all for watching. A full list of tools and materials used for this project will be linked in the description below. Please let me know in the comments if you have any woodworking advice or cool ideas I should try for a future project. Thank you.